Welcome, everyone, to another From Talk to Action Milden webinar. Like I said before, my name is Dr. Christopher Owen. I use he and they pronouns. For anyone who's visually impaired, I am white with large dark glasses, dark hair, and like a really cute little top with this collar on. It's black. It's cute. Today we're going to be speaking about from EDI to co-liberation, how internal policy shapes external communities. I'm going to start us off by reminding you all that this is a space to learn how to build inclusion into how your business runs. This is Toby's mission as part of Milden. As an associate of Milden myself, I am really proud to be able to support this kind of initiative. And it's my hope that you will learn some practical tips today on how to actively apply inclusion into your business and make it part of the DNA of your organization. Now, here's a question for all of you. Does anyone recognize this building? And I'm happy to open up the chat or a raise of hands if anyone can tell me what this building is. No, it's not York. No, it's not Westminster Abbey. Any other guesses? Oxford? Oh, we got Cambridge. It is in Cambridge. That's correct. The word Cambridge is on the screen. It's not Trinity College. So this is Great St. Mary's Church in Cambridge. Now, Great St. Mary's Church is located right in the center of the city. And there is a rule in Cambridge that all Cambridge students have to live within a certain mile radius of this church. It's one of the policies that they have. So all of the colleges are located within that ring, but all of the students, whether they live in their college or not, have to live within that radius. Now, this policy, when you look at arguments for it, it's about students being, with close to their classes and building a community and staying around their colleges. There is not a commuter culture within Cambridge outside of bicycle riding. But it has some pretty negative consequences. So for example, good luck finding an affordable flat within that radius. The rent within that space is extreme. The grocery stores available in that space include M&S, Waitrose, Co-op. I think there's one Aldi on the far, far edge, if you're lucky. It is a space that is extraordinarily expensive to survive in. Now, in this country, as you might know, there's sort of a rule that all universities charge the same amount for undergraduate students. And so in theory, anybody should be able to access the University of Cambridge and get an education there if they're smart enough. And we have this belief within our society that the top tier students, the smartest people in our communities, go to Oxbridge. Except we forget about rules like this one, where yes, your rent, your tuition might be the same, but what about your rent? What about your college fees? What about, all of the formal dinners that are expected of you, the networking spaces that are expected of you? It's actually extremely expensive to attend universities like Cambridge and Oxford. Now, this isn't me criticizing these institutions necessarily. I'm not saying that that bad people go to these universities or support these universities. What I'm saying is that we have this myth in our society that so long as you're smart enough and you work hard enough, anybody can go. But that's not actually true. And then when we look at, well, who does go? And we see that it's historically privileged groups. It's almost entirely white people. If you look at the statistics, there's very few people of the global majority outside of international students from wealthy families. But British-born, especially British-born Black students, I think you could count them on your hands. Like there's very, very few. Um, and the result, the people who do end up going to these universities, interestingly, become very powerful people, very successful people. In fact, I think it's something like 70-odd% of our prime ministers are Oxbridge educated. I think that really tells you something about the system of power that exists within our communities. The University of Cambridge is not an inherently evil space, but it does exist within a system that is unfair. We can understand this unfairness through 4 different mechanisms. And I'm going to use a framework here developed by a Black feminist scholar named Patricia Hill Collins. And she calls this the matrix of domination. So the first area is institutional. So this is how we organize how easy or difficult it is for different social groups to access opportunities. So I mentioned a few institutions, just now. I talked about religion with Great St. Mary's Church, education with the University of Cambridge, housing with, the rent prices within that space. Travel is an institution and access to that space. These are all different institutions, and they all interlock and work together to make accessing education at the University of Cambridge more difficult. You could add banking to that as well, of course. You can get a student loan, but that will cover your tuition, but it doesn't necessarily cover all of the other expenses that you would accrue living at the University of Cambridge. And the only way to get a loan is if you're at least the only way an 18-year-old is going to get a loan is if their parents can afford that loan. So you can see how there's a generational wealth issue here. The second is bureaucracy. This is how we manage decision-making power, manage who gets to have a voice, and it functions to maintain current social hierarchies and the status quo. The policy that you have to live within a certain mile radius of Great St. Mary's Church, that's bureaucracy. And if a student said to the university, well, I can't afford to live that close, the university would turn around and say, well, I'm sorry, that's our policy. Who do you fight? What do you do? Right? It'll be a lengthy, complicated, difficult appeal process. And some students do it, and they do manage to get something sorted out sometimes. But it's all self-advocacy. It's a fight. And it's a fight not against a person, but a system. It's complicated. The third is beliefs. These aren't just I don't mean things like religious or political beliefs. What we mean here is these sort of invisible things that happen that make things that justify mistreatment and oppression through common sense. So for example, that belief that the best and the brightest go to Oxbridge, the smartest people in our communities go to Oxbridge. That's a belief. It's not actually necessarily true or fair, but it then justifies that our greatest politicians and decision makers are Oxbridge educated because they're the best. And therefore they deserve to be there. They have a right to those positions. And therefore, Black communities and marginalized communities, just aren't as good. So they haven't deserved those opportunities as much. And the last one is an interpersonal area. This is the way that we treat everybody on a day-to-day basis. Our lived experiences, from microaggressions and unconscious biases to outright bigotry, hate crime, maybe even genocide, depending on where you live. Our interpersonal experiences shape our relationships with other people, how people speak to us and treat us, and have a serious impact on our sense of self, on our mental health, on our ability to form communities. When I was in Cambridge, I learned of townies and gownies, the people who have the Cambridge gown and the people who don't. And I found myself in a position where I experienced being treated like an outsider despite living in the city because I wasn't a Cambridge student. And I think that tells you something about the way that it reinforced social hierarchies locally. and the difficult experiences that locals might face on a day-to-day basis. Now, like I said, the University of Cambridge, people who go there, not inherently evil. And systems of oppression, historic systems of oppression, like racism and ableism and misogyny and patriarchy, Cambridge didn't invent those and didn't create those necessarily. No one institution did. But we are all part of that system, whether we like it or not, right? You're part of it, I'm part of it, your business is part of it, you know, everyone you know within this country is part of that same system. It's not our fault that the system is unfair. But what are we doing about it? Because sometimes our policies that might seem like they're just internal policies, this Great St. Mary's Church policy is meant to be about the University of Cambridge's students. It's not meant to be about wider communities. And yet, it does have an impact on greater systems of power and privilege and opportunity on a larger scale. And we can really see that. What's your role within that system? What we're going to look at today is the way that our policies can sometimes contribute to those systems of oppression, and sometimes they can actively work to change them, to change the system, and make our society more fair and free for everybody. When we look at these 4 areas, right, we can think about what's going on. So I've talked about education, housing, healthcare, and financial, all different institutions, right? Bureaucracy, these are going to be things like proof of credentials. When you're hiring somebody, getting that proof. The administrative burdens that they might have to go through. So if you're asking people for their gender marker and they're non-binary, there's a huge administrative process that they have to deal with now, right? Unfair policies and who has decision-making power. All of these are bureaucratic mechanisms that are going to contribute to the harm of marginalized communities. With belief systems, we want to think about, for example, meritocracy. Meritocracy, right, is that idea that people get opportunities based off of merit, right? That's that same myth of people who went to Oxbridge deserve all of the power and privilege that they have because they're the best. That's meritocracy. It ignores the hard work and the intellect of working class communities, for example. But we also have other beliefs within our society: competition, individualism, the need for control and ownership, essentialism, and this idea that everybody from a certain community behaves the same way. And I think we're seeing that really significantly right now with the way we're treating immigrants and asylum seekers and refugees, and this idea that they're all the same. We're seeing pathologizing, especially of trans communities, and erasure of lived experiences. These are all different functions of belief systems that harm marginalized communities. And lastly, of course, we have our interpersonal side with our stereotypes, our microaggressions, our bullying and our harassment, right? And I think sometimes businesses are really good at addressing this one. They're really good at, unconscious bias training and, teaching people about how to be a good ally and, reminding people that it's against the law to bully. Like, we're pretty okay at this one. But all of these things are interconnected. All of these domains work together. We have forgotten what workplace inclusion efforts are for and where they came from. A lot of organizations see it as a way to follow the law, to treat their people right, to make sure that people feel like they belong. It's the right thing to do. Some have understood the business case and are looking to improve in innovation and investment, and broaden their market. But our laws in this country around equality and inclusion come out of social movements. We would not have the rights of women in the workplace if it wasn't for the suffragettes. We would not have the rights based off of race and ethnicity if it wasn't for groups like the Black Panthers. social movements came together to demand a shift in society. But then what we did is we started hiring these communities into our workplaces and forgot that the whole point wasn't just so that they could get jobs. It was so that they could have a seat at the table and be a part of the decision-making processes that shape our communities. And the result of that is a system of severe inequality. And I think we're all experiencing this right now. We're all experiencing, for example, a significant wealth inequality crisis right now, and a cost of living crisis right now. Unless you're making over 10 million pounds, and if you are in this call, call me. But I don't think most of us here or any of us here are making over 10 million pounds a year. And that 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 shift means that there are certain people within our country who are doing great. They are making loads of money. They are living very comfortable lives. But the strong majority of us are experiencing the highest rise in poverty in the last 30 years, right? We are seeing just a worsening climate crisis. We are seeing global politics that are off the scale, right? With disasters all over the world, including things like genocide. We are seeing political division like I don't think I've ever seen before. And communities are at each other's throats, fighting over scraps and resources, while the mega elite hoard as much as they like. The fact of the matter is, we are not going to solve our problems on our own. We are not going to solve these crises on our own. We have to work together. We have to come together. Because all of these systems of harm are interconnected. They're all interconnected, right? And it's not enough to just say, oh, well, we're gonna, you know, improve working class access to Oxbridge by getting rid of this one policy. And, then, working class people should be able to afford to be able to attend Oxbridge. It's not going to address the systemic racism that's going on there. It's not going to address the misogyny inherent in their spaces, the extreme levels of homophobia that I experienced in those spaces. It's just not going to happen. We have to look at it as one larger picture that addresses all of these issues. The fact is, and this is from the Combahee River Collective, a really important anti-racism organization, they've shown us that major systems of oppression, they interlock, they work together. And the synthesis of these oppressions shapes everybody's lives. And so their argument is that in order for Black women to be free, it would mean that everyone else would have to be free too, since our freedom would necessitate the destruction of all the systems of oppression. We can't solve the climate crisis or the cost of living crisis unless we also solve the hierarchies and the erasure and the other like systems that justify a domination over people and planet. It's all connected. And so what we need to do is shift our understanding of workplace inclusion and tackle it at the source. So I've got here a quote from Catherine D'Ignazio and Lauren F. Klein, and they argue that we need to see that oppression is the problem, right? It's not just like discrimination in the workplace. There's a larger system of oppression. That's the problem. And then workplace inclusion and equity processes, that's a path to solving the problem. But the desired goal, where we're going, is co-liberation. It's the collective and collaborative liberation of all marginalized communities. And that means that we have to challenge power at its source, and it means we have to have different metrics of success. It's not going to be about your diversity stats. It's going to ask different questions, deeper questions. Let me show you what I mean. Equity, right? Standard approaches to equity ask questions like, well, how can we ensure ensure that all current and potential employees and clients have equal access to our offers. We want to make sure that every employee, has the same level of access to getting their work done on time, feeling comfortable in the workplace, accessing promotions, getting paid well. That's equity. But Collaboration asks, what community initiatives can we support or implement to mitigate the systemic barriers that disadvantage marginalized groups? So for example, if somebody's got an Oxbridge degree and they apply for a job at your organization, their CV is going to look really impressive. And if somebody who couldn't afford to go to Oxbridge applies to your organization, their CV is going to look less impressive. But the person who went to Oxbridge was trained in how to interview well, was given the social connections to get the right job opportunities and to get their foot in the door. There is a knowledge and skills gap that's being created by this system. That's not your fault. But what could you do about it? How, instead of improving equity within your organization, how can you improve equity within your communities? Can you implement an educational program or a skill building project? For example, when you're hiring, can you put on some workshops or webinars or a resource on your website on how to succeed in an interview and what you look for in a CV? If there's a skills gap, can you put on some skill building workshops in community centers? I heard of this great example of a fire department, a fire and rescue team who wanted to improve their diversity. So they went into their local community center gyms. They knew that their applicants needed to be physically fit, so gyms were a great place to find people, but they went into the community center gyms in the areas more densely populated by marginalized communities. And they just helped build some skills in those spaces. They didn't pitch, they didn't sell, they just delivered skills. And then when they were recruiting, they could put up signs within those community centers, and they got way more applicants from marginalized communities, applicants with the skill set that they were looking for. The systems of oppression that were limiting those applicants beforehand were not that fire department's fault, but it was something that they could take responsibility for within their communities. Another question that we might get typically is in diversity. We might say, how can we hire and promote the highest number of social groups within our organization? We want those diversity numbers to look, really promising. The problem with that approach is what we're regularly seeing are organizations where marginalized communities are only hired in the lowest paid, with the lowest paid roles, with the least amount of security, and the least amount of decision-making power. And so what you get is marginalized people at the bottom of this pyramid, and then historically privileged groups at the top. Well, I'm sorry, folks, that's just a microcosm for white supremacy. All we've done is replicate a system where primarily white men are in charge of marginalized communities. We need to be asking different questions. For example, who do we need to redistribute resources to, assets to? Who do we need to redistribute decision-making power to so that everybody plays an equal role in shaping our communities? Your organization is part of a system. How it shapes that system, the role it plays within that system, is going to be informed by the people with the most decision-making power within your organization. And if those people are primarily from historically privileged communities, they're going to shape your organization in a way that maintains their power and their privilege. So who do you need to redistribute that decision-making power to, those assets to? Lastly, here I have that traditional inclusivity might ask, how can we create a workplace where everyone feels supported and respected, where everyone belongs, right? Which is lovely. But what we'll do a lot of the time is create a workplace where the majority feel like they belong. And we know about issues of people hiring for culture fit rather than culture add. We know that that's an issue. But really, we want to think about not just how we, create inclusive workplaces, but how we create communities of care. I sometimes hear, and this is a like, ugh, like a big pet peeve of mine, but I'll hear businesses say like, oh, we're all a family here. That's not true. It's not true. No, you're not, your colleagues, right? But are you a community? Do you show up for and take care of one another? Community isn't something you land in, it's something that you build, right? So how are you building a community of care? One that celebrates and looks after everyone. And why would anyone trust that you're doing that authentically? Where's the proof, right? It's it's got to be active and intentional community building, right? Take care of one another. So let's now think about how you could apply all of that to your organization. We've thought about how you fit with amongst different institutions and other organizations. This might include, for example, your suppliers, your partners, and other stakeholders, right? We've thought about bureaucracy, the policies, and the decision-making power. We've thought about the belief systems that might justify why certain policies or why certain partnerships are in place and why it's necessary to have those things that limit access to opportunities for marginalized communities. And we've thought about that interpersonal side, the bullying, the harassment, the hate. In order to shift away from these things, we need to know where we're going. I think a lot of organizations have a vision for their business, right? They're like, in 10 years' time or in some undetermined future, we're going to be the best at selling this service or product. You know, like we are going to be the leading voice in this subject matter. We see that quite a bit. But what's your vision for your community? What does co-liberation look like to you? Really picture it. We're so good at saying, oh, climate change is bad, the rise of the far right is bad, genocide is bad. Great, agreed. What's good? What's the alternative? What does it look like? And try and get specific. This is actually a Black feminist technique called imagining otherwise. It's not just about utopian thinking. It's about reflecting on what's not working now and what the alternative would be. Imagine otherwise to our current state of being. What does that specifically look like? And then, how are you going to help build that world? How can your organization get involved in creating that co-liberated future?